Thank you very much. And you all can hear me very well, yeah? Nice. Good. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this amazing event. It's quite the honor for me to join you all and to talk to you about the things that I think are tremendously important that's going on right now in our age of authoritarianism. So especially thank the organizers, Julio Juan Alfaro, Alvin Sario, and my dear brother, Haji Saji. Without him, I don't think I would be here. So thank you very much. It's as we know, it's 9 a.m. or so there in the Philippines. It's 9 p.m. here, so we are precisely on the other side of the world. But this, through the wonders of this kind of technology, we get to talk to each other, and that was a dream of generations that came before us to be able to have something like this. So interesting enough, my birthday is next week, and my wife surprised me by bringing all my children home. So as soon as I get done here, I'm going to celebrate my birthday with my kids. I've got one in New York, one in Chicago, one not too far away from here. So yeah, it's quite the gathering just outside my door. But I told them they can't interrupt. So what I want to talk to you about today is what's being called our current polycrisis. So the polycrisis of our age. And a polycrisis is precisely what it sounds like. It's a condition wherein numerous existential crises are occurring simultaneously. So it's a convergence of crises, right? The magnitude of which causes humanity to act in ways that are irrational, self-defeating, and ultimately detrimental to the survival of our species. And chief among these crises, I chose three. There's many more, but these are the three that I'd like to talk about tonight. And the first one is the ontological crises of modernity. And this pertains, of course, to humanity's sense of self, our sense of meaning, and a sense of optimism about the future. The second of the crises is the epistemological crises of modernity, which pertains to the ways in which we understand truth, our ability to distinguish between that which is true and that which we want to be true, and our ability to witness for truth when we are fed lies constantly, mistruths, misinformation, disinformation. The third of the crises is the political economic, which echoes Antonio Gramsci's famous dictum that, quote, "the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters," unquote. We live right now in an interregnum of uncertainty when the old world order is in decay and the new one emerging does not promise really much greater freedom, greater prosperity, or greater autonomy, but rather something more sinister. As a political philosopher deeply rooted in critical theory, in psychoanalysis, and in the Abrahamic religious traditions, I tend to see these three crises overlapping. One feeds upon the other, right? Nevertheless, for clarity, I will try to keep them separate, at least for this discourse, with the understanding that in reality, they are intertwined, they are codependent, and they are co-determining. I also want to make it clear that these crises are not uniform around the world. I cannot assume that the social ailments of the West, from which I come, are the same social ailments for the rest of the world. That is a form of civilizational projection that the West has done for a long time, where our problems were meant to be the problems of the world because we never looked out of our own form of group narcissism. So we want to necessarily decenter the West here. So when I talk about these problems, I'm predominantly coming from a Western perspective with the understanding that what is normative in the West is not necessarily normative in the rest of the world. Nevertheless, some of these issues are not relative to one society, one culture, or one civilization, but infect humanity as a whole, as we are all dealing with the overall contours of modernity in our own way. So if we can have the next slide. So the first of these crises is the ontological crisis, what I call the Unbehagen of meaninglessness. Unbehagen, of course, is a German word that means the uneasiness. It's not necessarily the fear, right? It's not necessarily the hatred. It's an uneasiness with the meaninglessness of modernity. So, as you all know, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously heralded the death of God in his 1882 book, The Gay Science. Nietzsche did not argue for the deicide, but rather described in a parallel what was already taking place, at least in the West. 144 years have gone by since Nietzsche's controversial claim. A lot has happened, of course: 2 world wars, the development of nuclear armaments, the rise of fascism, communism, unprecedented technological development, evidenced by the very medium we're using right now, as well as the rise of conspicuous consumption. The holistic and totalizing connectedness of family, of people to the earth and to God has fractured and is broken in many cases. The death of God, as Nietzsche knew, gave way to extreme ethical and moral relativism, wherein individuals not only were impelled to individualize, as C.G. Jung, for instance, thought it was necessary for each individual to individualize. So we're not only impelled to individualize, but also to construct ethical worldviews that correspond wholly to our subjectivity. Subjectivity, of course, being brought into Western history by the ancient Greeks, when they emphasized the I and personal responsibility and personal virtue. But it was also brought into the West more forcefully and championed by Martin Luther, when it was the consciousness, his consciousness was dictated what he had to do in this world, and how he could not bend the knee when he thought the church was wrong. So while this individualization is wholly necessary on a psychological level, as not to become an automaton, a fully determined individual determined by heteronomic forces, it came about during the rise of capitalism, this individualization. And so what did that do is that transformed individualization into almost a very aggressive form of mammon worship, or the adoration of money. So capitalism plus extreme individualization. This mammon worship, wherein that which is dead, capital, commodities, consumer goods, this became the dominant mode of being in the world, what the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm called necrophilia, or the having mode of being in the world, as opposed to the being mode of being in the world. The result of this has been the growth of nihilism, which you can define nihilism in some kind of way as humanity's inability to find meaning in the world, a world increasingly determined by mass consumption, digital mass distraction, mass identity formation, atomization, alienation, instrumental reason over communicative reason. As the life of the spirit has been neglected and or abandoned, necrophilic ways of being have become normative. And what I mean by that is education is no longer about character formation, but rather simply about career. Intersubjective relations are less about fraternal being with each other and solidarity, or agape, and more about what the other can do for me, right? It's almost like a transactional relationship. Politics is less about making life better for all, and more about enacting policies that concentrate power in the hands of the few. Economy is less about meeting the needs of a people and more about accumulating wealth that is used to overcome the deficiencies of meaning, of being, and deficiencies of community. While Nietzsche encouraged mankind to create his own ethics and moral systems after the death of God, we have even failed to do this. Today, the corporations and political parties inform us through mass media and social media of what we ought to believe, whom we are to hate, how to be patriotic, and which products will make us feel good about ourselves. Homo consumens, or the man of consumption, is a product in many ways of Homo corporatum, right? The corporate man. So unless we are consciously rejecting this type of being in the world, we as a species have been thoroughly influenced by the demands of corporations, of governments, and other powerful entities, often without even knowing it. We've become subject to heteronomic forces. What made us susceptible to this radical colonization of our ontology is the disconnect between humanity and the spirit of humanity. Now, I don't mean spirit purely in a religious sense, although the spirit that is found in religion is the dominant aspect of what I mean by spirit. It can also be secular in many cases. Here, spirit indicates something beyond ourselves, something beyond the narcissistic, beyond something that's the narcissism, both individual narcissism and collective narcissism. Spirit, in this sense, is an intangible connection to that which is still a mystery, a mystes, right? Remember, the Greek mystes means that which can't be spoken of. But that which can't be spoken of, not because it's a secret or some kind of secret information, and Gnostic information of a given society, but that which can't be spoken of because language doesn't have the capacity to articulate the reality of that which one is trying to speak of. And so in this case, we're talking about the mystery of God, or the mystery of community, the mystery of family, the mystery of agape, and the mystery of eros, right? We have a disconnect from that mystery, right? So as the mystery of life in all of its facets recedes, we are left with looking at the world and history with all of its beauty taken into account, but also with all of its horror and terror, Golgotha history, if you will, right? Or what Hegel called the slaughter bench of history, history as world judgment. Because those are the two sides of history, the two sides of the world, the beautiful, the good, the true, but also the destructive, the ugly, and the evil, and the untrue. So that in itself is both a reason to despair that we've lost these things in many cases, but also we can think of it as an invitation to reconnect to the mysteries of life, to recommit oneself to those mysteries. The danger, of course, in recognizing that we have been disconnected from those mysteries is that we have a cheap return to religion to escape existential dread. And what I mean by a cheap return to religion, the philosopher Theodore Adorno pointed out that oftentimes when we have these return to religion movements, they're more often than not a philosophy of religion. And what does that mean? That means that it's a form of thinking about religion, because you relate to religion as a way of, in a way that why you value it is because it does something for you on a social level. But you're not necessarily convinced of its claims, right? And so people will return to religion. They say, well, I'm returning to religion. I've become religious for the community. I did it for my family. I did it for all these other things, a sense of belonging, a sense of a mission. But the problem of that, of course, is that a political movement can do all those things as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religion, right? A social movement can do those things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religion. So it's the true and authentic, the non-cheap return to religion is when one really is converted to the beliefs. They are convinced. That seems to be a very authentic return to religion. And I think that kind of return to religion, the real contemplation of the mysteries that are articulated by religion is absolutely necessary if we are going to return or overcome at least the ontological crisis of our age. Okay, next slide. We also live in an age wherein we have access to the world's knowledge at our fingertips. I say this to my students all the time, that my God, in your pocket, on your phone, you can pull up the works of every great Greek philosopher, right? Every great medieval theologian, right? Every great modern philosopher, sociologist, right? So the greatest of all literatures. It's right there in any language that you want. And yet we spend so much of our time dwelling in the manure of meaningless entertainment, right? We entertained ourselves with just intellectual numbness, right? So I say this to myself first, always as a reminder, as a critique of myself when I, go on social media and I find myself, I just passed a half hour and I've really done nothing. I've killed time. And time is something that is very precious. Time is something that we have to value because we have to use it for something that's meaningful, and yet we don't, right? That's part of our condition in modernity. And so, for my own students, I'm always happy when I walk into class and they're talking to each other because they don't do that very often, right? People they don't know, or they know they're sitting right next to them, but they don't talk to each other. And so this is a problem, right? Because what are we doing? We're choosing for the quick hits of dopamine, right, in our minds via TikTok and other social media, as opposed to the long, concentrated studies of philosophy, of theology, sociology, literature, and history. Those take a dedication and discipline to sit and read and contemplate and rethink. And that's not what we have in this type of world. That's not what's valued in our day and age. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I've heard from students in the institutions that I teach at that they didn't read the book, right? Or they didn't even buy the book. They never had the book, right? And so this is something that, is deeply problematic because it's contributing to our epistemological crisis, the crisis of knowledge and understanding. Right? Why? Because our education systems have abandoned dialectical thought, right? The creative critique that we would have in dialectical thought. And they've abandoned it for the safety of positivism, right? Wherein we focus on mass memorization and repetition as opposed to creativity, critique, and transcendence. Positivism doesn't question the status quo, if you will. It seeks to reproduce it and reproduce it in a very smooth way. Positivism, while necessary for the hard sciences, has neutered the humanities and as well as the social sciences, wherein the knowledge one should gain about the world in the humanities, in the social sciences, how to think about the world, how to act in the world, how to critique oneself as we relate to the world. All of that is replaced by the narcissism of knowing facts. An intellectual, an educated person is someone who's accumulated facts as if they're consumer goods. So just as we would say someone who lives in a large home and multiple cars, and they can take long vacations and have a yacht and whatnot. So we would call that someone rich in this world's means. Someone who we'd think is very intelligent is someone who simply accumulated these facts, right? But this is a deep problem because accumulation of facts is not necessarily thinking, right? It's not necessarily thought that propels us forward, especially not in the age of authoritarian politics, right? Where we have to remain critical of what is in front of us. And we'll get to the authoritarianism in a second. So, in other words, what is the role of education, right? People would say, unless the object of study contributes to my career, it's worthless, right? So why should I have to take courses in history? Why should I have to take courses in philosophy? I should be able to just do my studies and what I want to do because my career is what's important. Because my career is going to allow me to gain access to a certain lifestyle. It's going to let me gain access to a certain neighborhood that I want to live in. It's going to allow me to buy what we call in the U.S. a McMansion, a cheaply built, very big house, right? It's going to allow me to have a Mercedes and a BMW, right? But the substantive things that makes life meaningful, right? That's lost. It's just lost. It's not there anymore, right? And so career through positivistic education has in many ways killed the idea of the good life, right? The good life that, yes, needs are taken care of, but a good life that is dedicated to the mission of knowledge and understanding the world and cultivating autonomy and a balance of autonomy and solidarity and all these things, right? So what's the problem? While one can be full of facts, philosophical facts, theological facts, social wisdom remains alien, right? When wisdom remains alien, one cannot see beyond the given, beyond that which is right in front of us, right? One is mesmerized by the given. One is fooled by the given. One does not recognize the camouflage that the given deploys as it seeks to conceal reality. When this is the case, critique of the given appears as propaganda. When one is beguiled by the given, critique of the status quo appears as conspiracy theories. Nothing penetrates those whose intellect and consciousness has been captured by the flattened reality of the socially constructed illusions, right? Created to perpetuate a smooth reproduction of the status quo. On top of this, we live in an age wherein the monsters that Gramsci spoke of engage in what we call agnotology. And the pervasiveness of agnotology is ungodly in many ways. So what is agnotology? Agnotology is the intentional creation of ignorance, right? The intentional creation of ignorance. We think about ignorance as a state of not knowing. We all live in that kind of state of not knowing on many things. I always tell my students I can talk to you about political philosophy, theology, sociology, psychoanalysis, all this stuff. But if you ask me about motorcycle maintenance, I'm completely ignorant, right? But if I want to overcome that ignorance, I could study some and overcome the ignorance, right? So it's a state of not knowing that is rectifiable. But what agnotologists do is they deliberately create ignorance, oftentimes for the profit of industries and whatnot, industry and government. So agnotology is not meant to convince the other of a truth or an untruth, but rather simply to blur the lines between what is true and what is false, so that the confusion that comes from this form of epistemicide creates a paralysis within a population, a paralysis that again allows for the smooth reproduction of the status quo. Now, good examples of agnotology are the tobacco industry, for instance. That's really where agnotology began, at least in the United States. In the tobacco industry, all they had to do is they had to hire some sciences, some very well-credentialed sciences, what we call scholars for dollars. And they would hire them to do studies and deliberately say, we're not sure if smoking causes cancer. The studies don't prove that, right? We're skeptical, despite the fact that they all knew that smoking caused cancer. But just having these well-credentialed voices in the public sphere saying that we can't really say that for sure caused enough confusion that it was just enough of a gateway for people to say, we just don't know, and therefore we continue on to buy the product that is killing us, right? The second example could be the fossil fuel industry, for instance. As it relates to global climate change, which obviously is one of the most, if not the most pressing issue of modernity. The fossil fuel companies would hire, again, a lot of well-credentialed scholars come in with their Ph.D.s in science and chemistry, environmental sciences, and they would pay them a lot of money to use their credentials to go into the public sphere and basically say, This certainty about climate change just isn't real. It's ideology. We are well-credentialed scholars, and our studies are telling us that maybe this isn't being created by human activity. Maybe this is just a natural cycle. Now, of course, 98, 99% of climate scientists tell you that no, global climate change is real and it's happening because of the burning of fossil fuels. But they just need enough voices in the public sphere to raise doubt about that certainty that causes confusion, which allows them to continue on to the status quo of fossil fuel industry. And you see that again with Trump's gaslighting. I live here in a country where we are now into our 6th year of President Trump, of course, with the 4-year interregnum with Biden. But we're now into the 6th year, and the gaslighting never ends. It's continuous. And when you talk to a lot of Americans, there's a large section of Americans who understand very well that the strategy there is to detach Americans from reality. So once we're detached from reality, he can continue to do a lot of things that are certainly for his own self-interest. And we, the people, will defend him doing those things. And so I'm sure you're all well aware of Donald Trump and his gaslighting, and it just doesn't stop. It never stops. But it creates just enough confusion where people can't tell what is true and what is untrue anymore in civil society, and therefore that allows that destructiveness that is created by certain people, a certain class, to go on unchallenged. Okay, next slide. The last crisis I want to talk about is the political economic crisis, or what I call the social catastrophe. The post-World War II rules-based world order that we've become used to has shown significant fractures in the decades after the end of the Cold War. Currently, the democracies of the world are challenged both by internal authoritarianism, and you see this in the numerous far-right populistic movements in the West, for instance, and actually in other places as well, including India. And so not only do you have internal authoritarianism arising, but you also have authoritarianism arising from abroad. In the U.S., of course, you remember in the 2016 election, you had a lot of interference within the election with Russia. And it's not hard to do that kind of interference that they did, right? Vladimir Putin, of course, was wanting to have a more friendly government, a more right-wing government. And the interference didn't come from, messing with the voting machines, tampering with the mechanism of voting and whatnot. It came from hacking the minds of Americans, and that was done through social media. And so that had an effect on Donald Trump being elected, presumably. There's no real way of proving that claim, but it's one of those claims that is just no longer controversial. So outside authoritarianism also has an influence, right? The authoritarian movements within a country. Now, of course, democracies, why are they going through these major fractures? They're also going through them because they're plagued by their own hypocrisy oftentimes, right? The democracy of hypocrisy, as it's called. And you get that type of politics when they would think of democracy for us, authoritarianism for you, right? Of course, in the current conflict with Iran and Donald Trump, and I want to say it, conflict between Iran and Donald Trump, because the American population doesn't have much of a conflict with Iran. This is Trump's war. But we have to remember that it was in 1953 that the United States overthrew the Prime Minister, Mossadegh, right? The democratically elected socialist Prime Minister, Mossadegh, in Iran, which started this whole thing, right? And then, of course, the U.S. Installed Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and then only for 1979 to be thrown out essentially by a coalition of the entire Iranian society from the left to the right, right, with clerics and bazaris and intellectuals and the workers, and they all threw him out. But, what comes of that is that, that the West, especially in the United States, who, let's be honest, is the focal point or the pole of the West, that it preaches a certain type of ideology, right? It preaches, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom, justice, democracy, except for when those things become barriers to the self-interest, especially of American corporations and things like this. And that's when the authoritarianism that is instituted in those countries becomes quite useful for the West. So that's the hypocrisy, right? That we see here all the time. They also are plagued, of course, by their own class reality, wherein capitalism has become stronger than democracy in a lot of Western countries, certainly here in the United States. That which is still democratic is quite weak, right? And that which is capitalistic is actually quite strong. And so with the election of Donald Trump, for instance, it's a direct control of corporations, of the state, and or if you could say of what I called a distilled bourgeois opportunist in another article I just wrote, that Trump is not a fascist. He's completely incapable of fascism. He has no ideology, and fascism is an ideology. Fascist leaders, of course, will put their life on the line and die for the vision of society. They will sacrifice themselves for the society that they want to bring about in their own countries and their own people. You don't have that in a Donald Trump. Donald Trump will sacrifice us, right? The Americans. He'll sacrifice our government. He'll sacrifice the world order. He'll sacrifice you, right? For himself. So a good fascist leader, and I don't say good and ironically, but there's no good fascist leader, but a traditional fascist leader will sacrifice themselves. He will sacrifice us. It's different, right? So what else you see in these societies with this rise of authoritarianism? You're seeing the rise of oligarchy, an authoritarian form of oligarchy, especially here in the United States with tech oligarchy, which is on the rise, right? With many of the most powerful and wealthiest men of the U.S. quite publicly calling for the end of democracy, which should be replaced by a tech oligarchy, the rule of the few and the rule of the wealthy. So the tech bros, as they're called, feel that they should be running society because they have accumulated the most amount of wealth, most amount of influence, and they're the geniuses, right? At least they think they are. And so that's a struggle that we're having, this form of tech oligarchy authoritarianism. So if we think about, how did we get here? We have to think about it in this way. The bipolarity of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the American empire, if you will, the bipolarity of the Cold War gave way in 1989, 1991 to unipolarity, right? The American power spearheading the West, which is now being challenged by those individuals and states that are demanding multipolarity. I'm critical of this claim, or critical of this desire for multipolarity. Why? Because those who are claiming for it, their vision for multipolarity does not move us forward as a species, as a interconnected world. It does not seek to expand upon the benefits of the Enlightenment, of the liberal international framework of law established after World War II, for instance. Rather, the proponents of multipolarity paradoxically seek to return to a new age of empires, wherein dominant poles within their ethnosphere subjugate the less powerful around them, right? It is said that the poles would protect the weaker states from the more powerful states. But who will protect those weaker states from the powerful pole itself, right? This is just simply a return to what we had prior to World War I and World War II, right? When you had still the empires. So this vision of a dispersed form of authoritarianism as opposed to a centralized one is meant to safeguard what the Nouvelle Droite in France, the New Right, what they call the right to difference, that all cultures have. All cultures have the right to be who they are, what they are, in their particularity. They don't have, or they shouldn't be subject to homogenization, right? All cultures have the right to difference. And this dispersed form of authoritarianism is going to do that. It's going to protect that form of right to difference. At least that's the claim. However, we have seen in the past that hegemonic poles too often seek to homogenize their populations, right? Hegemonic poles homogenize their populations to make them conform to the standards of the centralized people. You can see this very dynamic today in the way Russia, Putin's Russia, seeks to Russify Ukraine, to remove Ukraine's autonomous identity from its territory, to remove the Ukrainian language, to remove the idea that Ukraine are a people separate from the Russian people. That they are certainly related and they have a shared history. That certainly is the case, much like the Spanish and Portuguese. But that which distinguishes the Ukrainians from the Russians, that has to be terminated. And this is the fate of the smaller peoples, the weaker peoples, when a very powerful pole dominates them. And this is precisely what right-wing Russian philosophers like Alexander Dugin, for instance, this is what they champion, right? They often appear as the voice of the liberator because they're opposing what they think is unipolar imperialism from the West, in particular the United States. But while simultaneously they're making that claim, they're also arguing for the imperial domination by a multipolar world order, right? So instead of one pole dominating, you have multiple poles dominating, but you're still dominated. So it is reasonable, I think, to be critical of the unipolar world order that we live in currently, even though it's fracturing. It's certainly reasonable to be critical, especially the hypocrisy. And especially when it's managed by leaders who have failed to maintain the very rules-based order that they claim to represent. You know, one can think of the many liberal principles, values, and ideals of the U.S., and that is claimed to champion. And while at the same time, it's violated them. The sovereignty of states, how many countries have we invaded or bombed, right? The ban on torture, one thinks of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq and the torture that American soldiers and contractors were doing to Iraqis. The bombing of cities. One of my dearest brothers is a professor in Tehran, and I mean his residential neighborhood continues to be bombed, right? I mean, and there's no military there, yet he's being bombed. The deliberate targeting of civilians. I mean, my God, what we've seen in these last few years, the mass killing of civilians in Gaza, now in Lebanon, in Iran, right? Even here in the United States with our own protest movements against ICE, maybe you've seen that, where Americans who are exercising their First Amendment right to free speech were murdered by the state. But also things like the facilitation of genocide, right? I mean, Americans think of Trump being a horrible person, and I certainly agree with that. But we also have to remember that our president before him, Joe Biden, also facilitated the genocide in Gaza. We can't just sweep it under the rug because, overall Joe seems to be a nice grandpa-like figure, right? He nevertheless is responsible for facilitating genocide. As well as the annexation of territory in the West Bank, in Syria, and Lebanon, by the state of Israel. We all know that empires, unconstrained by law, their own laws, international law, that they all engage in violent lawlessness. So we have to ask ourselves, what is better? A unipolar hegemon that violates international law, right? Or multipolar, multiple hegemons that violate international law, human rights, national sovereignty, just like their unipolar cousins, right? They both do it. One does it with the English language, one does it with the Russian language, right? I mean, or other languages. There's not a whole lot of difference. So, unfortunately, the deeper the ontological, we talked about the ontological crisis and the epistemological crisis that we talked about, the deeper it goes, the more there will be a call for authoritarianism to take power and slay the chaos of modernity, slay the chaos of our ontological crisis, right? Our crisis of meaninglessness, to slay the chaos that comes from our epistemological crisis, is not knowing the truth and be able to distinguish the truth anymore. The authoritarian will give us meaning. The authoritarian will tell us what to believe, right? And therefore, they will be the remedy for the ontological and epistemological crisis. That's the problem, right? That's the temptation that we have. History tells us that in times of great unrest, disturbance, and spiritual vacuousness, frightened populations yearn for political messiahs, political strongmen who promise to save them from themselves and the hated others. This dynamic is embedded in our psyche. It is how we survived the earliest days of our species, by rallying around the strong man who could provide protection from the threatening other. However, we do not have to succumb to this fear, both real or manufactured. We have a choice, right? We all have a choice, regardless of what country we're in, what culture we're in, what religion we are, right? What our politics are. We have a choice. Do we bind together as a people, a single people in our infinite amount of diversity, right? Do we bind together as a people, as a species, as one humanity, right? And stand against the barbarism of the age? Or do we put courage aside and let the aspirant authoritarian slay the chaos, but subjugate us at the same time? For me, I choose to resist. Thank you.